We are live. Okay. Hello, everybody. I am your host for today. I am Rodney Campbell. Today, we have a very amazing conversation. We're going to be talking about compassion and borders, exploring the role of policy in refugee crisis, um, something that has been happening in on our globe, on our planet for a very long time. But we are here in April 2025, and we're going to talk about it now. I've got an amazing panel of guests that can bring some wonderful insight. So let's start bringing them. Let's start bringing them on the screen. Dr. Maren Ni Rahale. I think I got it. I was close. Hello,
Thanks, Rodney.
Associate Professor of Social Work, University College of Dublin. I love Dublin. It has a special place in my heart. Um, she previously worked as a social worker with unaccompanied refugee children, and her current research is primarily focused on the lived experiences of refugees and international protection applicants. Hello. I'm saying good morning. It's morning here, but hello, good day.
Hello, Rodney. Lovely to be here. Thank you for the
Yeah,
introduction.
lovely to have you. Next up, we have James Akun Akat. Get James on screen. Hello, community activist and national coordinator for South Sudan as part of the Global Compassion Coalition's Connection Program. He's been involved in various grassroots organizations and involves that focus on issues such as racial equality, environmental sustainability, and affordable housing. James, hello, good day. Great to have you. Next up, we have Dr. Tom Vickers, well, I'll say hello. Hi, Tom.
Hi.
Associate Professor of Sociology at Nottingham Trent University. He's been actively involved in research and activism concerning borders, protection, and migration for almost 2 decades. Amazing. Good to have you here.
Thanks for the invite. Good to be here.
Yeah. And then Ala Sareye. Dr. Ala Sareye. Hello.
Hi.
Senior lecturer in sociology at Lancaster University. Her research and teaching specialisms in migration, including refugees, young people, and activism, center on questions of inequality, political power, and social justice. Hello.
Hi, thank you for having me here.
So, you all, we we have our topic. We have the idea that we're all here for. So, I am here to try and weave the conversation and tie some threads together, but and really to learn from you and help our audience learn from the brilliant minds that you all are. Um, I think I'm gonna jump in and Dr. Ala, I want to ask you a question. Um, as we think about this topic, um, very broadly, who sets the terms as we think about that criteria for compassion and who is included or excluded? How do you think about who sets the terms?
I mean, I think that is a key question in when we're thinking about whether we even use the word compassion, because I think, and I expect many people listening today will have had different kind of responses from people when you say, well, whether you say and when you say we need more compassionate policies in whatever particular area it is that you work on. I think when we're thinking about migration and particularly the conversation here, um, when I started writing about compassion in migration policy, one of the things that drew me to that was that I felt that very much the terms of what we mean by compassion and what compassionate policy may or may not look like was often set really by either by those in political power or by those perhaps advocating for refugees and other migrants, but not so very often by people on the move themselves. And I think that's really key in whether we see compassion a, a, as a discourse and practice, as a progressive approach, or with certain limitations to it.
Yeah, that makes as you were saying, I was like, yes, that makes a lot of sense. We don't actually set the policy from people that are actually on the move and actually need the policies or affected by the policies. That's a very interesting point. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that they want to add in. Feel free. Uh, I'll leave a moment.
Sure. I mean, I think this is directly connected to questions of voices as well, and kind of who's actually heard in these discussions. Because if we look at compassion as feeling with others, then if we're not even hearing from those others, then that makes it very difficult to feel with them. So yeah, and I think it's just overwhelming kind of silencing of refugee voices within so many of the discussions that happen around borders and protection and migration.
Mhm. I think that's a good. Actually, you saying that makes me think. Level setting on the definition of compassion. I mean, Global Compassion Coalition, but like feeling with others and acting to relieve the suffering. Especially as we look at policy for refugees, it's like, well, if we're trying to feel and understand, and then also move to relieve the suffering. Knowing who sets those terms is actually going to be really important because their perspective is going to play into the decisions that are made. Um, so, as we continue to talk about compassion, let's talk about compassion and oh my goodness, that's a tough word. Politicization. Nope, my brain's not doing it today. Um, as we look at the politics around how we how we make laws and policies, is it helpful to depoliticize? There it is. I did it. Is it helpful to depoliticize or is it detrimental? And when we're thinking about this, Dr. Allah, I'll start with you and then I'll move around.
I mean, I suppose I'm going to go with both. I think it depends. It's sort of It's always about there's something on both sides of that. I think it depends on the timeline. I think often I can see the argument for depoliticization, in that it is often so difficult to move in a positive way in this very restrictive policy environment that sometimes to try to reach out to other people that may have quite different perspectives, there is that the sort of argument that if you point out that people's humanity, about what you have in common, the other kind of aspects of people's identities, people's rights, and so on, that can help almost sort of weave past those political views that are in tension. But I mean, it's very hard. I think in the long term, it's quite hard to do that. I mean, it's very hard to depoliticize anything. It's always going to be a very politicized issue, and again, it comes back to kind of whether people themselves who are on the move necessarily want that to be the case. So, for example, I mean, if we're thinking today in 2025, for Palestinian refugees, for example, and I've seen this argument made that don't necessarily want the issues there just to be talked about in humanitarian terms, because if we're talking about politicized issues, it's a highly politicized issue, and I think the same for people on the move elsewhere. I think it can leave out issues that are very important to people who are themselves subject to those policies.
So I'll leave a pause if anybody wants to comment, and then I have a follow up.
I might just come in for a minute. I think Alice points about the voices of the people themselves who are on the move are so important. And when, like, so for example, in Ireland at the moment, we have really a rise in anti-refugee sentiment, and increasingly you have more protests against accommodation for refugees, and it's in the context of a housing crisis, for example. And I think that there are certain voices that are heard quite loudly, and then there are others that aren't. So a colleague of mine, Graham Finlay, talks about the people who protest are these kind of rapid reactors who, like, if accommodation is coming into their area, they rapidly react to it and speak loudly. And politicians then can sometimes they can come on board with that, or they can be afraid to have a different approach. And the people, on the other hand, who maybe advocate for refugees and support refugees, they're kind of more reflective type of reactors. So they're not people who come out all guns blazing, if you like, and start reacting and giving a very firm position on things. They tend to be more reflective and need more time. And I think then the people who themselves are the people who are housed or coming into Ireland or into other countries, they're almost completely silenced in those discussions. And and I mean, there are competing debates about that too, because we want to hear the voices of people who are affected, but at the same time that needs to happen in a very ethical way. So it's not appropriate for a journalist to just to suddenly go into a center and ask people their views. We have to be very careful about it. But I think that really kind of contributes to the narrative and the discourse around these kinds of issues.
I think that's a really helpful frame, especially since I opened by asking who sets the terms. You just mentioned kind of a first mover's bias that sets often policymakers' minds, whether it's accurate or not, may or may not be relevant, but it's action quickly. So that's actually really interesting. Actually, Dr. Marine, I was going to follow up and start to ask you a little bit about um, how when this is being set and as policy is being looked at, um, how is the idea of compassion affected by the vulnerability in the situation and or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think um, it's probably really relevant how vulnerable people are perceived in society. So, like a lot of my research is around unaccompanied refugee children. So, children or young people who are under the age of 18 and they arrive without a parent or a caregiver, and they're very much constructed as vulnerable children. Now they tend to be, in the Irish and in the UK context as well, and I think in a lot of countries they tend to be 16 or 17-year-olds, but they're, I guess, society, they're seen as children. They are children, and they're constructed as being vulnerable by virtue of the fact that they are of that age. And I think there is more compassion shown then towards them because of that construction. But then if a young person is 16 or 17 and they don't fit that kind of normative, if you like, Eurocentric idea of what a child is. So if you have a young person who has, had conflict in their country of origin, has left home, has traveled, through many countries and arrive now in, let's say, in Ireland, and they've had a range of different experiences that have both contributed to some vulnerability, but also caused them to have to act as adults and as more grown up than maybe I would expect my children to be at that age. And then, but if they portray themselves in that way to society, then there's not that same level of, compassion, I think, shown towards them. So they're seen as, people then start to get suspicious as to whether they are in fact children. Their age starts to be questioned. And then, I think Al has written about this. We've seen that in the UK in relation to the young people who Lord Dubs brought to the UK, that pictures are shown of people and they're seen as though they don't look like children. So I think the vulnerability part of it really plays a role there. And of course, we all know 16 or 17-year-olds who are more mature maybe than the norm, and we see that as a good thing in general in society. But when it comes to refugee children, that's maybe portrayed as not such a good thing, or that they're not as deserving as our compassion. And of course, the boundary or the border between being a child at, who's arrived at 17 and a half, and being someone who's arrived at 18 and 10 days, like the how can we say that the 18-year-old is less deserving of compassion or care or support than the young person who's arrived at 17 and a half?
Do you see a difference between male presenting and female presenting refugees, and with the especially with the concept of fear, I'm gonna put air quotes up,
Mm,
of like that
mm.
aging them up potentially in the eyes of those uh,
Yeah,
around them?
yeah. I mean, I think, well, in certainly in the Irish context, the anti-refugee protests that we've seen have often talked about men and particularly what is termed single men. So men who have arrived by themselves without family members or dependents. They, of course, may not be single. They may be married and have children. They may not be. And they're often, so protesters will often say things like, we need to protect our women and children. We need to protect our communities. And there's very much a narrative of that these people who are arriving are not safe and our communities are not safe. And of course, some of those people that we're talking about are young people who are like very young men, so 18, 19-year-olds perhaps. And some of them may in fact be children, but haven't been accepted to be children. Um, and so, yeah, absolutely. I think the way that men in particular are perceived, and the fact that I suppose men are maybe not considered to be by default vulnerable. So there's
Wonder-
this an assumption that if you arrive as a female refugee or as a child refugee, you are vulnerable. But if you're a male refugee, you're not vulnerable. Yeah.
Uh, Dr. Vickers, I see you, I see you nodding there. Anything you want to add in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think this all sort of fits into these representation of refugees as only being kind of acknowledged or kind of recognized in a very limited number of roles, that either people can be seen as vulnerable, but then they're also expected to be passive and they're portrayed as victims and, and objects for kind of charity from more powerful kind of sections of society. Or if they're recognized as being more active, then it's only as a threat.
Mm,
So it's
mm,
sort of the terms for protection are, you have
Mhm.
to be passive, you have to be quiet, and if you express any kind of agency, then you get portrayed as a threat.
And there's a there's an element of this that I'm very familiar with in the States, and there's this, why don't you speak up? But if you speak up, you're too aggressive, right? Like,
mm,
there's an interesting question or an interesting thought in the comments. I just want to read it and see what you all think. Um, from Greg McGillivray, maybe? Maybe we might be close. Greg, I hope I didn't butcher it. Why should there be terms on extending compassion to others? I think this kind of goes back to the question of politicization. But what are your thoughts on that? Um, and we can go around. Yeah.
I can jump in. I would say that there shouldn't be terms, and I think sometimes that the issues that Wirren was setting out there with, and Tom as well, with the, as soon as you stop presenting in this very limited way as vulnerable, then suddenly you've breached the terms for compassion. I think that is some of the problem with that kind of discourse. And I would say that there shouldn't be terms. Yeah, I mean, men should be welcomed, and treated humanely and with respect and solidarity as well. That would be my argument.
mm,
Mm.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I see everybody. I see everyone nodding, and I think the hesitation was like, wait, no, yeah, there absolutely shouldn't be.
mm,
From the
Yeah.
political standpoint, I think um, there are things that cause there to be terms. People are afraid of losing their home. They're afraid of losing their parks or their whatever. And there are operators that move in a political sphere who will fight against. And I think there is a need for savvy political. I think this is where the idea of depolitization has cuts both ways, because we need people that are deft at moving in a political sphere to support and protect those who can't, as we're talking about, speak up for themselves because they are
Mm.
highly vulnerable. But at a human level, no, there shouldn't be. And I, Dr. Soraya, I think that's interesting. You mentioned there is like um, at the end of it, I think I heard you say like part of this is we get stuck in the boxes of what we know, and that limits our problem solving and thinking about how do we help those. It doesn't. It may not mean that we're buying everybody a house, but that's not necessarily what's needed in the situation. We can get more creative in that. Any other thoughts on that comment?
I guess I feel like it's about this kind of very singular depiction of people where people are perceived in this like was said, like in this kind of put into a particular box. So then the terms of compassion depend on what box you're put into. And it doesn't give enough room for people to be seen in multiple different ways, like Tom was saying, that you can have some vulnerability but still have agency, and be able to stand up for your rights or be able to ask for certain things. So yeah, I think the terms that we're putting, that are sometimes put on compassion, are around that if you fit in a certain box, you'll get a compassionate response. And then
Mhm.
people are kind of almost maybe forced to fit into those boxes and to make decisions, or to not be themselves and not be able to express themselves the way they would like, because they know that the response will be different. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's this is all affected by the way that our relation to others is framed, and and the role of kind of nations and kind of thinking on a sort of isolated kind of national basis has a huge impact here in terms of how those terms are shaped, because I think something that's very influential, certainly in the UK context, is the idea that refugees' first relationship to Britain is the point at which they arrive in Britain. So, the idea that, Britain has nothing to do with the situations that are creating refugees, and therefore it's purely a case of people arriving out of the blue, and then it's a question of, a sort of a one-sided question of kind of, well, what can British society to provide to people who are arriving with needs,
Mm.
without taking into account the way that British investments and British state military interventions, are creating British arms sales. I mean, in so many different ways, Britain is implicated in the situations that force people to become refugees in the first place.
Yeah.
And if you bring that into the discussion, then suddenly it looks very different in terms of the responsibilities that British society has, and kind of the role of Britain's kind of international entanglements in generating the wealth that is in Britain in the first place, and calling into question whether that is, justly something that can be withheld from people who are arriving from the places that have been exploited from British companies, British capitalism.
Fair.
Could I just jump in there
Absolutely.
as well?
Yeah.
And
Jump on that.
I mean, really to agree with Tom that as well. It's a very presentist way of looking at international relations. It's sort of not taking account of that big thing called the British Empire and the long history of those entanglements. And I think in the context of Britain, that's always been the issue with immigration policy and responses to immigration. It's like, why are all these people coming here? Well, I wonder why they're coming here, and why do so many people who are coming here also happen to speak English and know so much about Britain? There is that sense of people only appear on the border, and that's where the story starts. It's a very limited way of understanding people's relationship with these islands.
And oh man, the arc of time is so long, and our history, our individual history is so short, and it's so I catch myself doing it, and I know we as people, as an animal, tend to have a hard time seeing around the next corner And I think one simple question that I ask myself as I listen to this conversation is, what if it's me? What if I need to go somewhere for help? What if I need to leave um, California or the United States and go north or south, or cross an ocean? How am I going to be treated, and how do I want to be treated?
Mm.
And that's as we talk about compassion, I think those are questions we hope are being asked, but so often are not. There's some interesting cases. I know, Dr. Vickers, you have some interesting cases that you've looked at. I just learned about one in the United States. It's interesting. I was talking to a neighbor. There's a book called The Great Escape, talking about Indian refugees who were brought here to help post Katrina in New Orleans, and were exploited and never paid, and actually marched to Washington, to and it required a huge political effort. Like, some people had to sign up and raise some funds in order to help. Um, I kind of want to jump off that and ask, what does it take to have a voice as a refugee? W- and I'll start with you, Dr. Vickers. Like, what have you seen as refugees are trying to have some agency and have some voice?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and it's taken lots of different forms, and yeah, I mean, in the UK context, I mean, there's a very long history of refugees organising, with other refugees, and and with British citizens and other migrants, and yeah, and building organisations to articulate that voice, going back, yeah, decades and decades, and and as kind of people reach different stages of kind of their journey sort of within British society. So recently I've been working with a trade union, GMB, organising with Amazon workers, and quite a lot of those Amazon workers being exploited by Amazon inside warehouses are from a refugee background. And
Hmm.
managed to get status and protection within the UK, but are still in this very precarious kind of exploited situation, where kind of working in an Amazon warehouse is the work that they've been able to get, and many of them are driving Ubers or doing other jobs alongside that. But they've been organising and building bridges across this incredibly diverse workforce. Yeah, to kind of fight for their
That's a
rights.
little bit of layering and nuancing. So they have a level of protection. They've been able to establish some status, but within that, they're still trapped, if you will. Um, it seems does that do they have a little bit more voice, or not so much, like, than you've seen in other situations?
I mean, they have more legal protections.
Yeah.
They have more. They, but yeah, I mean, there was yeah, a research participant in research I did years ago in Newcastle. The way she put it was that her experience of getting refugee status within Britain is, it's like kind of moving from a cage, but then you get status and you realize it's a gilded cage, and yes, it's better than it was before, but you're still faced with this incredibly difficult situation. And other research we've done looking at things like unemployment rates amongst refugees in Britain are very high, and partly structured by the system, because people aren't allowed, they're prevented by law from working for so long while their asylum claims are being processed. So then if they do get their asylum status and the right to work, then they're entering the labour market from this period of long-term unemployment. And that makes it much more difficult to get into work, and then that limits people's choices for work, and so then people end up working at places like Amazon. But I think that's also the kind of those circumstances also create opportunities to form common cause with other exploited sections of society, and build those kind of platforms for shared voice. And
Mm.
Interesting. There's an interesting correlation between voice and legal status that I'm pulling out as we're talking, because I guess that's a lot of what we're talking, like what ends up happening. Um, I don't, Dr. Marine, I
Yeah.
don't know if you had
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, no. I mean, I suppose like I think again, like obviously some people come with a, people come with a voice. Like just, people can arrive and obviously some people feel able to voice how they're feeling and to be able to advocate for themselves. So,
sure,
I think it really depends on, like I interviewed a young person recently and she had a really strong voice in terms of like saying how she asked for things when she arrived and she knew what her rights were and she was frustrated in not when she didn't get them and so on. So think sometimes people can have that. But absolutely, I think, if you don't have your status and you're afraid of the outcome of your claim, and even not just even your asylum claim, but if you're living, at least in the Irish context, like if you're living in some kind of center like a reception center, you may be afraid to like voice, if you're unhappy with the accommodation or something to do with where you're staying, you may be unhappy or afraid to voice that because you might be afraid of being moved to another center, or not even necessarily, the ultimate outcome of your asylum claim. Even if you have some belief that, well, that will be a fair process, you're afraid of the other things. So, being afraid that you'll be moved to a different center, that you'll be treated unfairly. And, in terms of what it takes, your question about what it takes to give a voice, I think like that that the people who are there supporting people. So, in the Irish situation, we have a lot of people working in centres like these who don't really have qualifications in the area or training really, and that's both unfair on them because they're working in a very complex area, and it's unfair on the people, of course, who are receiving the service. And if you have people with the right kind of backgrounds, you would at least hope that there'd be more of a rights-based approach to how people are treated, and that people would feel more able to have a voice. So, I've done research with unaccompanied minors who have been living in centres where the residential staff in the centre have given them a voice by facilitating them, for example, to make a complaint about previous care. So they've been supported by people to be able to do that. So I think, yeah, and then I think just like solidarity, a feeling of, so I'm when I think of people not having a voice, I again think of people maybe living in centres where there's protests happening outside. So
hmm,
the just like a lack of safety, like if there's people protesting outside the place where you're living, you're not going to feel safe enough to have a voice. So having solidarity initiatives within communities where people come together and show that, well, okay, those protests are happening, but we also have people in this community who are happy to support you, who want to work in solidarity with you, that will hopefully help to give people a voice, and therefore show compassion, I suppose, in the in society.
yeah, and um, that uh, the moving from center to center. I think a lot of that is to because it's happening here, is a lot of it's to silence the voice that exists, and or keep people from being able to connect with those that can help them express that voice in a clear manner, um,
Mm.
which obviously goes directly against the idea of a compassionate response, and it really just takes away the I'll say fairness, and I think that's kind of what we're a little bit of what we're talking about in the political sphere is like often it comes to the loudest or the first to speak, and those that have the authority to move and do things, and that can move with or without compassion. Uh, you know, unfortunately, um, before I
I just, Rodney, I
yeah,
might just pop in. I just noticed a comment in in the comments there. Like I think it's really important to obviously say that, of course, people who don't have a voice or who don't speak up, um, are need our compassion as well. So there's going to be like in every sector of life, there are people who speak up and who tend to have their voice heard, and there are people
Mm,
who don't, and who don't want to, like who are not going to be the people speaking to a journalist or campaigning for better rights, and what, like, there should be no obligation on international protection applicants or asylum seekers or refugees to do that. Um, people might want to just come and just be safe, and of course they need compassion too. Um, yeah, I think it's just important to highlight.
thank you. Yeah, good catch.
Could
Um,
could
yeah,
I say there as well that
absolutely.
that is also important when we're thinking about who is able to speak up, that they may well be, wanting to represent not only themselves but also their community more broadly, but also that we do need to recognise that heterogeneity, the differences within communities of people, for example, living in reception centres in Ireland, that those who are more, not speaking up may share those views, but may also have slightly different experiences, and that might be, also, other aspects of people's identity maybe come into it, in terms of how precarious people are, for example, depending on gender or sexuality, or other sorts of experiences that people have had. So often we see this with more, established refugee communities, that you have the sort of the leaders of the communities that are very often speaking up and being represented, but sometimes that's not necessarily sharing the perspectives of everybody in that community.
Mm, yeah, that's a very good point. Um, and that's actually, you bring that up, intersectionality of all the things that we bring every room we walk in, and that applies to refugees in our space as well. And um, I'm interested, as I look at the comments. We're kind of talking about some questions about compassion, and um, there was an earlier comment that often uh, we look at. Well, I'll just read it. Whenever refugees start getting financial freedom, it scares us. We look at them as those that should depend on humanitarian aid, and I think it's the wrong perspective. And I think that points to fear a little bit of, like, um, the uh, the scarcity mindset of, if someone else is able to obtain, then it lessens the pot that I can pull from, which isn't actually true, but that's how we. It's some people. There's a fear mindset there, um, and as we look into our communities, how do we leverage compassion to help, bring aid to those that need it, and start to, even, Dr. Soraya, you mentioned, like, some people aren't going to be for the idea of supporting others, but how do we gain support? How do we garner support to help, even when there are going to be dissenting voices? So, any thoughts there, from the panel?
I mean, I think, sorry, Tom, did you want to come in first? No.
Oh, okay.
Um,
I'll
okay,
just be
go for
very
it. Go
brief.
for it. You go.
Just,
Yeah.
no, I was just going to say, I think it's about recognizing connected interests and recognizing how we are connected to other people already. But yeah, go on.
Mm. Yeah, no, I agree. Like the kind of, I suppose, drawing attention to shared humanity and what people have in common. Like there's so much discussion about how people are different to each other, um, and how that difference that difference creates this, among some communities, a sense of fear. And in fact, people have so much more in common with each other.
Hmm.
And I think, really, initiatives that help people to get to know people of refugee background are so important. And of course, they can be like specific types of initiatives, like, that are set up. So, for example, we have a great organization here in Ireland called the Sanctuary Runners. They've moved, I think they're in the UK now, and in some other countries. And basically, they're community based people who run together. So, refugees and local communities who go running every Saturday or whatever. So initiatives like that, but also just more like broadly more initiatives. So obviously we're all working in universities. So universities having mechanisms that allow people from refugee backgrounds to be part of the university community, to attend. So if I teach on a social work program, we have lots of people from different backgrounds on the program, and I think having people of refugee background on the program mean that other students meet them. So they might be students who would never go to an initiative that's specifically about solidarity with refugees. But if they meet people in their everyday lives and get to know them,
Yeah.
that's probably even better. Like it's just in normal life that you're meeting people. So the more we can create opportunities, like we talked earlier about unemployment rates, if we can create opportunities for people of refugee background to be employed, to to be able to take part in society as they in the way that they want, of course, then that's going to mean that we meet more people, and we have that people who are afraid, and of course we can talk about why people are afraid, and um, and so on. But at the end of the day, some people are afraid. So if you have opportunities to meet and to develop relationships with people, I think, and to have that kind of shared humanity, I think that will really helps. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. Anybody want to add on or add add their thoughts?
I think just that I again agreeing with Tom and Wirren, it's almost I guess in this, it's perhaps depoliticizing the refugeness or the migration aspect, but politicizing other aspects of why people might be struggling or suffering. And I think I was really struck by that in Tom's example of the union workers organising together, union workers from different backgrounds. Like Maureen said, that students meeting in a very everyday kind of context where you form those relationships. And I think it's also been we can also see examples of that in kind of struggles around housing conditions and housing rights. Certainly, I think it varies in what context people are living in, but in Britain, people seeking asylum. And then even people who then go on to get refugee status are often living in some of the most of the private parts of cities where there's often already struggles around all the things that go with poverty, around housing struggles, around access to various key services, schools. When people come together around those sorts of issues, I think that's where we can see opportunities to develop that solidarity without people feeling that they are being pitted against each other for these very, very scarce resources, or that migration is causing that when it's actually already underinvestment in those very scarce resources.
Mhm.
Something I would love to try to do to kind of, so we're moving into the back part of this, and I will say for anyone in the comments, please keep adding comments. Any questions you have for any of our amazing panelists, please drop them. And I will. So as we're talking about policy, I think it'd be interesting to maybe try and list out some policies that we're aware of, some maybe that are detrimental, that are causing roadblocks, and then some that are good, and then uh, bridging from that into possibilities. Marin, you just mentioned some with the universities and
Mhm.
finding ways to help people find a place in common society. But what are some of the policies that are causing roadblocks now that we're aware of as a group here?
Like I think in the Irish context, just a lack of investment in community services, in youth work activities, community work over several decades has really now put us in a position where, or contributed at least to a position where there's this rise in anti-refugee sentiment. So when communities have been under-resourced, where there aren't facilities for young people, where there aren't enough youth workers, then that's going. People feel marginalized, and people feel like Ala was saying about if there's poverty in communities and people are feel disenfranchised and that they don't have enough, then that contributes to um, I suppose not being able to show compassion or finding it hard to show compassion. So I think like investment in those kinds of services at a community level, where and then like communities then can come together, like was said, and we can have like we recognize that there isn't enough housing for anyone. So if all these communities then can come together and go, like, we need housing for everyone, and people in this community who are are Irish and have lived here, or born here and lived here all their lives, we need community, and people from refugee backgrounds and migrant backgrounds need community, need housing, and they need housing as well. If they can come together, I think that is really important. um, and then I think organizations, so we've had good experience in Ireland, I suppose, of housing organizations and migrant or refugee organizations kind of being on the same page and trying to really ensure that the housing issue isn't blamed on refugees, and that they come together and they mix, they're clear on that. I think that's really important as well.
Mhm. Yeah. I don't know if you want to jump in there, Tom. I see you. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, yeah. I mean, I think that there's a whole raft of policies in the British context that are roadblocks, to that kind of compassion and kind of people coming together, because they differentiate people's rights based on their immigration status, and so in housing, in a separate housing kind of system for people who are claiming asylum that we've had since 1999. And that it also involves people being dispersed around the country with no choice over where they go to. So it kind of uproots people and makes it more, and sometimes, like you were saying with detention, forces people to move on from place to place to place, depending on the kind of, completely opaque decisions that are made about people's housing. People being prevented from working on the basis of their immigration status. And so, all of that means that you might have two people who are living next door to each other, both living in really poor housing conditions, but their immediate, landlord that they have to protest against, and their route out of that housing poverty is completely different. So then it makes it much more difficult for people to come together and organize together. And then we have all the policies that have been brought in sort of in the last decade, which have meant that a lot of people in all sorts of jobs, people working as cashiers in banks, people working in universities, people providing healthcare, are required to monitor the immigration status of people receiving their services. And I think, that has a really sort of powerful ideological impact in terms
Mhm.
of habituating people to
Mm.
essentially,
Mm.
kind of racially profiling as a consequence, but,
Yeah.
profiling people on basis of their immigration status and then withholding services. But it sort of habituates that kind of suspicion and kind of
Right.
other people that they're coming into contact with.
Yeah. That's interesting. That racial profile. It's like a legal racial profiling, right? Like it's like, are you legal? Are you not? And it's like, wait a second, that's a person. Like,
Mm.
and but it adds that layer to it. Very interesting. What about that, Dr. Soraya? Anything you want to? What do you think about policies that
Mm.
are detrimental right now as we look at the world?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think um, I'd really say in sort of two areas. One, I think there need to be policies that allow people to continue with or rebuild their lives, so that people are not finding that they're coming to a halt, or feeling unable to continue to look to the future. And that's particularly in regard to education and employment. I know in the US, but for a long time there's sort of undocumented young people and their struggles to continue with their education and to legal employment. So those sorts of, I mean, particularly for young people, if they feel that there isn't that future for them, it's so dispiriting.
Mm.
And yes, to be able to work, to not then be put in a position of dependency. It really changes the power dynamic and ability to form relationships of solidarity. And I think on the second area would be not to cause further harm to people who have suffered so much.
Mm,
And for that particularly, I would say, and this is probably a global thing, well, it is a global thing really, is the rise in immigration detention and the harms that come with that. And we definitely see that beyond Britain, certainly in the US and in other parts of the world, harming people even further through the conditions that they face in immigration detention, which also so many of those people then are harmed through that, and are then they're not being returned to their country of origin. They're going out and living in the communities.
that harm them. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really not helping in that long term
Mm.
settlement.
Yeah. And that's two really big mentions for education in the conversation. And I think as we look at kind of the back to the arc of history and what detention centers can lead to and what they can mean on a large scale and small, education, like even knowing where that's something I see missing here in the States. And even the nuance of the conversation when we're talking about the politics of, say, undocumented workers here in the U.S. or throughout the globe, and how they contribute to the economy, because they do in a huge way. And when they
Mm.
are not available, the economy suffers, meaning people, everybody suffers. It is really a reach to, uh, you know, what we need is policy to help us understand how we're connected and see
Mm.
that we are all connected, and that as you succeed, I succeed, and vice versa. Um, and what
Yeah,
other? Yeah, go ahead, Doc.
sorry, Rodney. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
just want to follow up on Ala's point about causing more harm, like,
Mm,
even outside of detention, like in the Irish context, for example. I talked about earlier about men, and since like February 2023, we haven't had enough accommodation for asylum seekers, and as a result, single men are just not accommodated,
mm,
are often not accommodated on arrival, and at any point in time, there's about 3,000 or more men who don't have accommodation. So again, going back to the point about like vulnerability, they may come into the country, and we could, at a bit of a stretch, say that they're not vulnerable at all. Um, but then they're put into this context where they're told there's no accommodation. They're given a voucher, directed to go to a charity to get a tent or uh, food, a shower, perhaps. And so the system vulnerabilizes them. So, and then, going back to the points that were made earlier, like, of course, if you're living in that kind of precarious environment, and, maybe after a few weeks you get accommodation, maybe that's in a more organized, tented facility, maybe it's in an emergency center, and it's a better type of accommodation, but it's very hard to plan. It's very hard to think about learning English, or you know getting work, those kinds of things. And then, so I think that is another example of where the policies can themselves cause more harm, and we need better, more compassionate responses than that. And then I suppose just important to point out as well that, like, um, we absolutely want people to have access to education and to employment, and so on. But we also need to be compassionate towards people who don't want to enter education, or don't want to work, or can't work, or we need to show compassion to that group as well. And of course, ultimately, as a society, we probably want those people to speak our language and so on, but we also need to think about what people want themselves. And
mm.
people also want to hold on to their own cultural backgrounds and their own languages. And that is still deserving of compassion. No matter, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and and the impact that trauma can have, and that
Hmm.
Mm,
point, that I've seen with multiple, the point at which someone does manage to get protection when they've come through, horrific experiences, journey to get to the UK, battle through the asylum system and then finally get protection can just be,
Mm,
yeah, a point of kind of, yeah, where it's very difficult to do anything else, and people have just been, putting so much work into holding it together for so long. And
mm,
what the system does and the policies do in the UK at the moment is, at that point, people are suddenly then thrust into the benefit system, evicted from their accommodation if they've been in asylum accommodation. Suddenly they've got to find, somewhere to live. Suddenly they've got to find a job. Just at that point where people are at a point of collapse and just need a period of recuperation,
yeah.
and support. So yeah, I think that's really important what Marin was saying.
No, we almost need a policy that is like the Hippocratic Oath, the do no harm. Um,
Mm.
it's such a excellent point, and um, yeah, I don't think that can be overstated. Like it's just it's, yeah.
And there's
Uh,
probably a bit of a simplistic maybe idea sometimes among the public that, well, someone has come from perhaps a conflict zone and they're here now, so they're safe. So what are people complaining about? Like, at least you're safe. And I think there's maybe a lack of recognition of, like, absolutely people are safe and people are usually really glad to be safe, but there's maybe sometimes a lack of recognition of the multiple challenges that people experience when they arrive. And I've met refugees who've said, actually, I'm not sure if my life is better here because
mm,
it's so difficult, and they're dealing, and even when they have status, like Tom was saying, or they have like, there's so many layers in terms of, worry about family at home, the language, wanting to rebuild your career but having multiple barriers to doing that, the different culture, not having the supports. There's so many barriers people face in that at that point. And I think there is sometimes maybe a little bit of a narrative of, what are you complaining about? You're here, you're safe. Other people from your country are still stuck in this war zone. And I think we need to really be careful about that and have more, develop more, I suppose, education for in Ireland, Irish people, so that they understand what this, or have some insight. Like, I don't understand because I haven't gone through it, but have some insight into what this might be like for somebody, because I think people don't really have a grasp of that.
well, and I think you give us an interesting example from the Irish context, thinking of young men or male presenting folks that aren't seen as vulnerable, so they're not taken care of. And there are many examples through time of what happens to someone who's left to fend for themselves. Like,
Mm,
they will do just that. We will survive. And that can look all kinds of different ways. But one of the fears often, or one of the rhetorics talked about when we're talking about immigrants and refugees is, oh, well, there is a dangerous, violent element, and that that can sometimes be almost a self-fulfilling type prophecy where we're not taking care of people and they are
mm,
learning to survive inside of whatever system that they're left with, just as people who grew up in any given area who are just trying to make it with what they have. And so in just saying, oh, they're here, we're done. This is
mm,
I often have this idea of call it the empathy paradox, um, where the difference between empathy and compassion. Empathy, I feel you. I am
mhm,
I am empathizing with your emotions, so I'm taking on how you feel. Versus compassion, I am taking that on, or I'm simply understanding where you are, but I am acting to actively
mm,
reduce and relieve your suffering. But with empathy, sometimes the problem can be, once I've felt your the pain, my brain says, okay, that's
sort of,
not good. I want to move on.
mm,
So now I've walked away and I feel better. I empathized, but you're still there suffering. And it's like we have to take that next. We need the policy to take that next step to say, like, you're here. We saw that you were in struggle and strife and problem. You're here now. Let's continue to relieve the suffering. Um, I know we're at the top of the hour. I know we have some more time for Q&A. I don't know if any of you would like to ask any questions of each other, or you have any other thoughts. I don't. I want to leave it all out on the floor, if you will, so that we because this is such a good conversation.
I mean, the another area I think that kind of warrants a little more attention and compassion is the area of family reunification.
Mm,
So people just being separated, and often refugees, and again, coming back to single males may often arrive by themselves but have family members and want to be reunited with them. And I suppose policies are often very restrictive in that regard, in terms of very strict definitions of what a family is, who's eligible for family reunification in terms of being dependents, and whether that includes somebody who's turned 18 or 19 versus a child. And then, just certainly in the Irish context, I was speaking to some colleagues about this earlier today, just the lack of policy and supports available to people when they are reunited. So when people have been separated, so the literature will tell us that people who are separated from each other, the person who's, say, in Ireland or the US or the UK, whatever country, it can be very hard for them to adjust to life in the new country and to integrate when they're worried about their family and they're separated from them. But then when family members arrive, the person who was here first has been here for several years. They've changed. They've been apart from one another. There's a whole relationship to kind of redevelop together, and they often enter homelessness upon arrival. So they're facing lots of structural integration barriers, while also trying to reconnect with one another and reestablish those relationships. And I think there's kind of a little bit of a narrative maybe there, or a perception that, well, aren't you lucky to have your family here and you can fend for yourself now? The person who was arrived first, you can kind of be the resettlement worker for the rest of your family, when that person in reality is still probably, often, not always, but often struggling with integration themselves and with
mm,
barriers. Yeah, and again, that if that support isn't provided and those policies and resources aren't in place, the people who are reunited, they're, those families may encounter a lot of difficulties in their relationships, and that will have a knock-on effect for generations. Like, that's not just a once-off blip in, and that's a, it's a big, it has repercussions
mm.
for that family and for society. Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
I would just say for the point about generations, I think it is really not just, and we've talked a lot about looking back historically, but looking forward. We know so much from research about earlier. I'm trying to think of the right term, but groups or people who've been on the move. There's so much research, for example, with Jewish refugees during the Second World War and the repercussions of those traumas on the next generations. I think as well we need to see it in that long-term way about people who are coming in and settling into their new sort of communities, and the repercussions for their family, for their children, their grandchildren, and so on. It's a long-term project. It's not the actions need to have that long-term perspective in mind. It's not the now you're here, you're safe, that's it. We've done the basics. Because
Hmm.
who of us wants just the basics? That's not what it is to be human. We want the best life that is possible, really. And that shouldn't be there shouldn't be a limit on that aspiration, that this is good enough. What would we want for ourselves? um
Mm. I really, man, that I feel like that going back to that do no harm, the policy, starting with the policy of do no harm, and then that really requires going into the layers of nuance to, family reconciliation, to what is the best life in the out, like what's standing in the way for outcomes for for refugees and really for everyone. I mean, I think that's just a good policy. Like, what harm are we doing? Um, so that thank you
Mm.
for all of that. What about you, Tom? What are your thoughts? I'm sure there's many.
Um, yeah, I mean, well, I think, and I guess how what that kind of discussion brings up for me is just how um, what an unstable, world that we're living in, and how much kind of rapid change there is, and just thinking about, what is happening with the climate and ecological collapse at the moment, and it's a yeah, a kind of a situation in which many more people are going to become much more vulnerable. And so I think, these kinds of things are going to become sort of directly impacting on more and more people's lives. And yeah, so I think just developing those kind of relationships of understanding and kind of living together and seeing our interests as interconnected, it's just, yeah, becoming more and more important.
Mm. It makes me wonder if we need some policy around determining who gets to make the policy. Because the
Yeah.
people who tend to seek control tend to want control and power. And that does not tend to lead towards compassionate policy, unfortunately. And maybe back to the education side, maybe we need to teach people who are compassionate how to be political operators,
Mm.
and how they might move in that sphere in a way that would be beneficial towards all. Because I don't I think of myself here and I'm like, yeah, I would never think about going into politics. I would have never thought about it. I'd never had a path. It never seemed appealing. But when we look at it, we need people who would not necessarily think about becoming policymakers to consider that. And there are a lot of ways to do it. It doesn't have to be directly, senator, governor,
Mm.
mayoral candidate. It doesn't have to be that. Um, but obviously, those are very direct lines that are affecting um, how those who come into our society are affected. Um,
Mm. And
so
Yeah.
maybe
yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry.
go ahead, Tom.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, I kind of have a lot more hope for solutions coming from the grassroots than coming from policymakers,
Right.
whoever, the individual people are elected. So I just, think about things like, example from my research in Newcastle years ago, where Congolese refugees who'd been dispersed and been housed in a very poor neighborhood in the east end of Newcastle upon Tyne, and they set up their own community centre because they'd just been dumped in this area with no support. So they managed to get some charitable funding, set up a community centre, and then, as other people have been saying, that local community was very under resourced, but they opened up their community centre to the whole local community. And so, so that kind of built those relationships and understandings and kind of shared interests through their kind of grassroots action. And recently with the organizing I was talking about in Amazon, that kind of the workers advocating for themselves with the union has led that trade union to start setting up a relationship for referring their members and members of their members' family for immigration advice, which is, yeah, not something that previously was a norm for British trade unions. So I think it's those kind of grassroots actions where I kind of really have hope.
Great
We're all
point.
distracted now, Tom, because we've been
Yeah,
listening.
no, I can't
Yeah.
compete with
We're
that.
Sorry,
done,
Tom.
we're done with panelists.
uh, I know, Maureen, you had an idea or a thought coming in. This
Yeah,
is
no, I've lost it. I've got completely distracted, so I have no idea what it was. I'm
all
sure it
right.
wasn't that important.
So maybe that's
Um,
what we need to do in policy conversation. Just bring the kids. Just let
Yeah,
them.
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
solve everything. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, awesome. So we're about out of time here. Do you want let's leave some parting thoughts, some parting, either a question or something you've learned from this conversation that you'd like to share with us all, and we can just kind of roll around the horn. I'll say I'll send the mic to Dr. Saraya to start. unless you're not ready, and then we can move to someone else. But yeah,
I'm ready. Yeah, I
good.
think.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in terms of policy, I think what struck me most in today's conversation has been that idea of finding where, you know, where people's common interests might lie in terms, particularly starting off with Tom's case of the union workers, and moving on to the other areas that we talked about. I think that's in a very practical way, you know, a way of bringing people together, and kind of from that, perhaps we work towards more compassionate attitudes. I think it's from that very direct, practical kind of action, rather than perhaps trying to focus on this idea of, I think in the comments, you know, how do you make non-compassionate people feel more compassionate? I mean, it would be lovely to have an answer to that. I think perhaps it's working in a very practical way first.
Thank you.
Yeah, I
Yeah, go
think
ahead, Marie.
yeah, Ala's point earlier just around like the need to look back, but also the need to look forward, I think is really important. So that we need to be thinking about, you know, there, and I think certainly in Ireland, but in other countries too, we can be very reactive. So, you know, there's been a growth in, or a rise in the number of refugees in recent years, and we react to that all the time. But we need to be planning, particularly in relation to climate change, for increased numbers, and, you know, making sure that we're taking into account what's happened in the past, and then also looking forward towards the future, and looking at that intergenerational piece and the impact on how that investment in people now will have a longer term impact. It's not just about now, it's about a long term, having a long term vision, I guess. Yeah.
How about you, Tom?
Yeah, and I would just add to that, and casting our net widely in terms of where we're looking at as well, which I think is, you know, is a way of kind of dealing with the sort of the challenges of being prepared when something locally does happen. If we've, you know, already sort of been taking a broad international perspective and seeing, you know, what is happening far away as directly sort of relevant to what we're doing locally.
Mm. I will attempt to do an off-the-cuff summary. My notes have been commandeered. Uh, I will say, you know, thinking about the idea of the politics behind the policy of refugees and people moving regions. You know, there is a lot of nuance. There's a lot of nuance, and the politics can help and they can hurt, and it's really thinking of it would behoove us to think more all, not just us here. I think we think about it, but as civilization and as groups of people to think about our history, think about our future, um, to really examine the idea of vulnerability.
Mm.
You know, the idea of who is vulnerable and why are they vulnerable, and what's preventing people from achieving what we would ourselves consider a great life, not just a good life, not just an okay life, but a great life. And how are we doing all that we can to do no harm? I think I'm going to wrap it with that because that that is kind of the biggest um, point that stuck with me that I'm going to be thinking about for the coming days. Uh, Thank you all so much
Thank
for
you.
this wonderful conversation. Reese, thank you for joining. Um, uh, Everyone in the comments, thank you for being with us. Thank you for interacting and engaging. And have a wonderful day or evening wherever you are. And this has been Global Compassion Coalition talking about policy and immigration. And we bid you all adieu.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.